first of all, Programming Hope, your first documentary. Tell us about it. What is it about?
Programming Hope was basically made to kind of put a spotlight on employment issues for adults on the spectrum. Um, it's kind of a positive, uplifting look at one particular place that's had a lot of success employing adults on the spectrum. So it's about the Non-Pareil Institute, which trains and employs adults to develop apps and video games for iPads, iPhones, Android phones, all that kind of thing.
Okay, great. We're going to get into non-pareil in more detail in a moment. Tell us a little bit about employment and autism. What are the facts and the figures on autism and employment with young adults and beyond?
Well, some of the facts are that 90% of adults that are on the spectrum are either unemployed or underemployed. So they may have jobs that, are way below their skill sets, or they have trouble keeping a job. If you talk to some of these guys, they may have had, 6, 7, 8 jobs in a short period of time because they didn't fit their skill sets, or they weren't interested in what they were doing, or there was a lack of understanding from the employer about the accommodations that maybe need to be made for somebody that's on the spectrum. Or the other issue is maybe that individual doesn't want to let their employer know that they're on the spectrum. Maybe they have Asperger's, they're high functioning, and they can kind of get by. But then there's a misunderstanding from the employer about why they may do certain things or act a certain way, and maybe that particular job just doesn't fit them.
Okay, well, Jack, I know your intention is to that this is a positive film, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But as a mom of a 14-year-old with autism, and I hear you say the stats on autism and employment and the problem, how can I be hopeful?
Well, I think the reason to be hopeful is that there are things happening right now. I did this film to spotlight one of them, but there's a lot of other things going on right now because people are finally starting to kind of talk about it, I think. You hear great stories about car washes where a father has employed his son and others, to work at a car wash. You hear about a jewelry factory, where they're putting jewelry together. Higher functioning people, like at the Non-Pareil Institute, that are interested in coding and video games and things like that, they're becoming coders and programmers. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a grassroots effort on all sorts of levels of the spectrum to create these options out there. And I think employers at traditional workplaces are starting to think about it too. Microsoft, SAP, you hear a lot of different initiatives where they're kind of scratching the surface about how can we use the abilities of this workforce and not push them aside and use them to their maximum potential.
Jack, what prompted you to make this film? I mean, you have a history in a great background in television production. What made you veer towards autism? Do you have it in your own family? What's the story behind that?
I do. I don't have kids myself, but my sister has an adult son that's on the autism spectrum. When he was 16, they came to Denver and on a trip to visit. He had been homeschooled by my sister ever since he was a little kid. She had all the answers basically, to get him to where he needed to be by the time he was 18. She spoke to me during that trip and said she really didn't have any answers at that point. After that, like, okay, what's next?
Mm-hmm. We call it falling off the cliff, Jack.
Absolutely.
That's what us autism parents call it, falling off the cliff. So
knowing my sister and the everything she had done to that point, I was kind of taken aback that she didn't really have any options, or that there weren't any options there at the time, and how much she was struggling with that. So I didn't have any intention of making a film at the time, but I did go on the internet kind of after that trip. I looked for myself to see, was there things out there, being done? And what was kind of shocking at that point, I found virtually nothing. and not just in the United States, but I mean, I was looking all over the world at different things, and there just wasn't a whole lot of people. There weren't a whole lot of people talking about it, and I thought, well, it might be a good idea to, I know there's a lot of sad negative stories about that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's something where if you could spotlight something positive, this might inspire others to, think about this issue and maybe do some things. And, that was the initial intent. And that's kind of what led me to this particular story. And that's how it got started.